Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is Eisenherz and today we're going to have a look at another 5 of the most frequently asked rules question and most common mistakes in cEDH. So let's get started. The mana value or converted mana cost of a card is determined by what is printed on the top right corner of the card. For example, Force of Will has a mana value of 5, Jeweled Lotus has a mana value of 0 and Deflecting Sword's mana value is 3. That's simple, right? But you often see people getting confused with cards that have an alternate casting cost, such as Cyclonic Rift. Cyclonic Rift has a mana value of 2, as it is printed on the top right corner. However, it can be cast for 7 mana instead of 2 mana, if you decide to overload it. This cost is not the mana value of the card. It is strictly an alternate casting cost, so a cost you pay instead of the actual mana cost on the top right corner. So let's look at an example where this is relevant. If player A casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift for 7 mana and player B reacts with a Spell Snare, the Cyclonic Rift will be countered, because Cyclonic Rift's mana value is 2, not 7. Also, if player C reacts to Cyclonic Rift with Mana Drain and counters it, they will only get 2 colorless mana in their next main phase, not 7. This general rule applies for all alternate casting costs, such as Force of Will, which, even though you can cast it for free, still has a mana value of 5. It is important to note here that you can only ever use one alternate casting cost at a time to cast a spell. For example, if you have a Deflecting Sword in your graveyard and an Underworld Breach in play, you may not cast Deflecting Sword without paying the 3 mana for it, even if you control the commander, because that's an alternate casting cost. In order to cast Deflecting Sword from your graveyard, however, you will have to escape it via Underworld Breach, and in order to do that, you will have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard and pay the spell's mana cost, because that's the alternate casting cost Underworld Breach dictates. Another example would be flipping into Cyclonic Rift with Urza. Urza's ability states that you can cast the Cyclonic Rift from exile without paying its mana cost. This is an alternate casting cost. Therefore, you cannot use a secondary alternate casting cost, so you cannot overload Cyclonic Rift. In short, the mana value of a card is printed on the top right corner. Alternate casting costs don't change the mana value, and you can only ever use the one alternate casting cost to cast a spell. And as a bonus fact, the X in a card's mana cost is always equal to 0 unless it is a spell on the stack where it is whatever you choose X to be. Sevinnes Reclamation sees a lot of play in breach decks because it's an efficient recursion spell and turns intuition into a one-card combo. Although being so widely played, I still see people getting some details about Sevinnes Reclamation wrong. If you cast Sevinnes Reclamation from your hand, you simply get to recur one permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. Easy. If, however, you cast Sevinnes Reclamation from your graveyard, you can create a copy of Sevinnes Reclamation after the original has resolved. This copy is not cast, it is simply created on the stack. But it is only created if the original spell resolves. So, if the original spell gets countered, there will be no copy of Sevinnes Reclamation created on the stack. Now here's the most interesting part. The way Sevinnes Reclamation is worded, it will trigger the copy ability anytime it is cast from the graveyard. It doesn't say that you have to use its flashback ability. Even if you escape Sevinnes Reclamation via Underworld Breach or cast it via Yawgmoth Will, you will get a copy of Sevinnes, because you technically cast it from your graveyard, and that's the only requirement you need to fulfill to get the copy effect. Cool, right? So keep that in mind the next time you escape Sevinnes Reclamation. And as a bonus fact, cards that were cast via flashback will always get exiled, no matter if they resolve, get bounced from the stack, get countered or shuffled back into your library. You will always have to exile the card instead. Usually, if you want to cast a spell, you pay mana for it by tapping lands, rocks, mana darks or using mana from rituals. However, there are a few effects that allow you to cast spells in different ways, such as Delve, Improvise, Convoke and of course Phyrexian mana. So let's have a look at all of these real quickly, but before we do that, we need to know how to properly cast a spell in Magic, because that is a bit more complicated than you might think. In order to properly cast a spell, you actually have to go through the following steps. First, you announce the spell. Second, you make choices on modes, additional casting costs, alternate casting cost, the value of X, and how you want to pay for hybrid or Phyrexian mana. Third, you choose targets for your spell if you need to. Fourth, you determine the total casting cost of the spell by adding up the casting cost, any tax effects like Thalia, subtracting any cost reducers like Sapphire Medallion, and then applying cost setting effects like Trinisphere. final cost of the spell is then locked in. 5th, you activate mana abilities to generate mana to pay for the spell's cost. And finally, you actually pay the total cost to successfully put the spell on the stack. Alright, so how do Delve, Improvise, Convoke and Phyrexian mana apply here? Delve, Improvise and Convoke allow you to use other means of paying for mana. These abilities are activated in step 6, so after the total cost of a spell is already locked in and after you have activated any mana abilities. Therefore, you can use all of them to pay for taxes like Thalia or Trinisphere. Phyrexian mana works differently though. You choose whether or not to pay for mana costs with actual mana or with life in step 2. Any tax effects like Thalia and cost setting effects like Trinisphere apply in step 4, so if you choose to pay 2 life for your Git probe, while there is a Trinisphere in play, you will still have to pay 3 more mana for it, not just 2. So in short, Delve, Convoke and Improvise allow you to pay for tax effects, while Phyrexian mana doesn't. And as a bonus fact, Krig's ability does not turn your mana symbols into actual Phyrexian mana. In fact, it works just like Convoke, Improvise and Delve, so you can use Krig's ability to pay for additional costs or circumvent Trinisphere. Lavinia is a very strong stacks piece that can stop lots of turbo stuff and other combos like Underworld Breach and LED. But often people seem to misunderstand how Lavinia interacts with tax effects like Thalia. If player A controls Lavinia, other players can't cast non-creature spells with mana value higher than the amount of lands they control. This effect only looks at the top right corner of a card. Additional and alternate costs are not relevant for this ability, so player B could cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift even if they only control 5 lands. If player A controls Lavinia and player B casts Mana Crypt, because no mana was spent to cast it, Lavinia will trigger and counter the Mana Crypt. That's simple, right? But what if there is a Thalia in play? Well, if player A controls Lavinia and player B controls Thalia, then player C can successfully cast Mana Crypt, because the tax effect is applied to the total cost of the spell, which means you actually have to pay 1 mana to cast Mana Crypt, and therefore Lavinia will not trigger. Does this also apply to Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora? No, because those aren't tax effects that get applied to the spell itself, but separate triggers you will have to pay for after casting the spell. So in the future, make sure to look at the actual mana value of a spell and check if there's any tax effect in play that will allow you to cast your otherwise free spell. Dauthi Voidwalker is another incredibly widely played and potent stacks piece. Its replacement effect exiles any cards that would go into your opponent's graveyard with a void counter. So what happens if a player wants to get rid of Dauthi Voidwalker? Let's have a look at 2 different scenarios. If player A controls a Dauthi Voidwalker and player B wants to get rid of it with a bounce spell like Cyclonic Rift, the spell will bounce the Dauthi Voidwalker, and only after Dauthi Voidwalker is bounced will the spell be put into the graveyard from the stack. This means that the Voidwalker is no longer in play when the spell is put into the graveyard, and therefore the spell will not be placed in exile with a void counter on it. The same is true for hard removal spells such as Abrupt Decay or Assassin's Trophy. These destroy Dauthi Voidwalker before they would be put into the graveyard, and therefore will not be put into exile via Dauthi's replacement effect. Damage and -X effects work differently though. If player A controls Dauthi Voidwalker and player B wants to get rid of it with a damage spell like Lightning Bolt, the spell will resolve before the game checks if Dauthi Voidwalker can remain in play. So Lightning Bolt will be put into exile with a void counter on it, and after the replacement effect happened, the game will check Dauthi Voidwalker's toughness, and a state-based action will then kill Dauthi Voidwalker. This same principle also applies to spells like Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge will also be put into exile via Dauthi's replacement effect, and only after that has happened will the state-based action kill Dauthi Voidwalker. As a bonus fact, all creatures that also die through the Toxic Deluge will be put into exile via Dauthi's replacement effect, because all creatures die at the same time, and therefore the replacement effect still applies. So in short, if you remove Dauthi with hard or soft removal, the spell will not be exiled. But if you remove Dauthi with damage or a -X spell, those will be put into exile, because Dauthi dies to state-based actions after the spell has already resolved. And that's it. I hope this video helps you to understand some common situations in cEDH better. If you enjoyed it, please let me know. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching. This is Eisenherz and auf Wiedersehen.